And so this is where I say to young people, I say, okay, how old was Jesus when he started his public ministry? 30.
Mm.
What was he doing prior to that? Well, Luke gives us the clue, right? He was growing in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So he actually worked a secular job. He was a carpenter, and then he went to religious school. He trained under the Pharisees. I know we think of the word Pharisee as a bad word, but actually Jesus was part of the order of the Pharisees. And then he started his public ministry in only from 30 to 33. And it's like, why, why such a short amount of time? And also, what was he doing? He was doing preparation prior to that.
Mm.
And so I always tell my students, don't just like drop out of school and don't say, I don't need education or I don't need preparation. I mean, I don't need maturity. You do. You absolutely do.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Up Next. And today I'm talking with a new friend. Alan, you started popping up on my LinkedIn, and I saw about your new role with Denver Seminary, all of that. I said, you know what? I better talk with Alan. We've never met each other, and you were nice enough to respond to my LinkedIn message. So welcome to you, Alan.
Thanks so much, Tommy. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, I am sitting here in freezing cold Chicago, Illinois. It's about less than 10 degrees out there, wind chill -18. You're sitting in sunny Orange County, California.
That's right. And this time of year, I'm really glad for that, I have to say.
Yes.
But I do love to travel. Yeah.
Now, have you always lived in California? Always California your home?
No. Well, I grew up in Southern California, specifically more in the Pasadena area.
Mhm.
And when I graduated high school, then I went to the East Coast and the UK for all my higher education. So I did my undergrad at Yale University. I studied history. Then I went up to Boston, did my MDiv at Gordon Conwell Seminary.
Yeah.
Then I went overseas and went to Scotland, actually did a second master's degree, a Master of Theology at the University of Edinburgh. And then I moved down to England and did my doctorate, Doctor of Philosophy at Oxford University. And I focused on Latin American missions when I was there. So I like to tell people that I'm actually a Chinese guy from the United States who studied Latin America in England. So, that's kind of my global background.
Alan, I feel like because we're Asian, I can say this to you. When you went to Yale and you were a history major, what did your parents think?
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. Obviously, I have immigrant parents, first generation immigrant parents, and, Tiger Mom, right? And actually, let me just clarify that. I know sometimes people think Tiger Moms are bad. I actually had a really good Tiger Mom. She really pushed me in all the right ways, right? Like, I hated all the things she pushed me to when I was young, and now I really appreciate all of them. Like, she was like, you have to speak Chinese. And I was like, you have to go to Chinese school. And I was like, no, I don't want it. And I'm so glad I'm bilingual.
Yeah.
She pushed me to go to church, and I hated it when I was young. I'm so glad I'm a Christian now, right? She pushed me to play the violin and the piano, and I hated it when I was young. And I'm so glad that I can play music now. It's such a gift, and there were so many things that she said, you got to do this and you'll appreciate it later on. And I really appreciate it. And of course she also pushed me academically. So honestly, I probably wouldn't have ended up at Yale if my mom didn't push me. And she was like, you got to get good grades in high school. And I did. And so, but then of course, when I get to Yale, originally I did what my dad wanted me to do, and my dad's not a Christian. So he's a businessman, and he said, you just got to make money. Right. So he said, you got to major in business. And I tried that and I hated it. It wasn't my thing. And then I took some history classes because Yale is really good at history, and loved them. And so when I, became a history major, my parents, even my mom, who was a Christian, said, what are you going to do with that? Right. And they, classic question. Right. And they thought, and then of course, later on, I decided I wanted to go to seminary, and even worse. Right. So I wanted to be a pastor or a missionary. And my dad literally said to me, I did not pay for your tuition to go to Yale so that you can become a pastor or a missionary. Right.
Yes.
So
yes.
So eventually they both came around, and honestly, because I did my doctorate at Oxford and I became a professor, they were kind of like, okay, that's good, right? So yeah. But that wasn't my original trajectory. I was going to be, I actually wanted to be a missionary because I love God, I love the world and travel. But then when you threw in the third one, I love studying, then it makes sense that I'm a missions professor now. So I did serve on a bunch of missions, and then now I've landed on being a missions professor.
Yeah, yeah. Alan, I mean, we're meeting for the first time, but I feel like we're so connected in so many ways because I literally had a tiger mom now. She's a little mean, but if anything, as much as she pushed me, she taught me the importance of hard work. That
Hmm.
lady was up all the time. She always stayed up with us when we were studying. And I look at my life and people, one of the things that people say, Tommy, why are you such a hard worker? How in the world are you able to push yourself? My mom
Hmm.
modeled it to me all the time. There was no other way. So I learned from watching her. Went to Washington University in St. Louis. My parents gave me an option: doctor, lawyer, engineer. Pick one. I was a chemistry major. After his first semester, I didn't want to be a chemistry major. Went to the business world, built cell towers for 10 years. I wanted to go into full-time ministry. My parents hated that.
Hmm.
But at the same time, once I got to the top of my profession at the cell tower industry, yeah, whatever, do whatever you want. I don't care anymore. And so, it took 20 something years to get to this point.
That's right. And, God works his way in ways that we don't see or expect. I mean, when
Yeah.
I was younger, there's no way if people ask me, what are you going to do when you grow up? I would never said missions professor, right? But now it all makes sense. All the things coalesce together.
Yeah. And it is funny because, and we're going to talk about young marketplace leaders and all. I know you do a lot of work. It is funny as I sit down, it doesn't matter who it is, from young marketplace leaders in Nairobi, Indonesia, Cluj, they'll sit there and say, Tommy, I just want to serve the Lord. I want to just go. I want to really honor him. But it's what you just said. It is looking at your past, looking at what God has been doing to really reflect and say, Lord, what are you teaching me through all these things, good or bad, that has made me who I am right now? And through all that, how do I set myself forward?
That's right. And I'm actually speaking of, I'm seeing these two different trajectories sometimes from young people. Some young people are like, "Oh, I just want to go on the mission field, and I don't want to get the education," and the others are like, "Oh, I just want to do the business or the things that make money. I don't want to go on the mission field." And so we're seeing these two divergent realities among young people, and I have some things to say to both of those types of
Yeah.
people.
Well, it goes back to what you're doing right now. Talk to me a little bit about what you're up to, because you have two different roles, one with Denver, another one with another seminary over at West Covina.
Yeah, it's called International Theological Seminary, and we really live up to our name. ITS is very international. 90% of our students are from other countries, mainly from the developing world, actually. So, and our mission is to train and educate and equip theological education for the majority world. So, majority world is Africa, Asia, Latin America. So, in other
Mm.
words, not the West. So, I'm actually the academic dean there. So, this is a new role for me. I actually, after 16 years of being a professor of missions at Biola University, I'm now transitioning from the classroom to administration. So
Yeah.
it's different. In some ways, I feel like I don't have as much direct impact on the students, but then I know actually that's not true. Even though I'm not teaching them in the classroom, I'm actually managing the whole system and the whole ecosystem of all the professors, and to enable them to be able to do what they do, right? So, in some ways, I think about it as the difference between pilots and air traffic control, right? Both of
Mhm.
them are actually working towards the same end, which is to ensure the success of the flight. But the pilots have direct interface with the passengers. They're the ones flying the planes. Air traffic control is, in the tower, making sure all the planes don't crash into each other
Yeah.
and land safely and are on time. And even though the passengers never see the air traffic control, as a dean, that's what I feel like. But they're so crucial to making sure the whole ecosystem runs smoothly. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, but it's a different skill set. So, and then my other job is with Denver Seminary, and I'm in charge of a Lilly grant that they got, which is to study Gen Z. So,
Mm.
a lot of people said to me, Alan, when you become a dean, you will never do research again unless you fight hard to keep it. And so, what's great about the Lilly grant with Denver is that I'm actually doing research. So I'm actually keeping one foot in the research world, and for me, these are my two passions. I love studying majority world Christianity and also Gen Z. So I
Yeah,
get to
yeah,
do
yeah,
both
yeah.
right now.
Speaking of your work in terms of theological education, are you finding that pastors in the majority world, is the MDiv still as important as ever? Or would you say, well, we just need some basic education, basic courses to understand what it means to really be able to thrive in our ministry? Where are you seeing things go right now?
Yeah. So it's really interesting because when you look at seminaries across the United States,
Mm-hmm.
they're all dying
Yes.
for the
Yeah.
most part. Low enrollment, declining enrollment. That's because the MDiv is not seen as,
Mm-hmm.
which is the flagship degree of most seminaries. The MDiv is not seen as something that's desirable or needed anymore. A lot of people are like,
Correct.
well, if
Correct.
I want to become a pastor, I don't need an MDiv. Why should I spend 3 years, all this time, all this study, all this work, all this money, whereas my church will just let me be a pastor, right?
Yes. Churches don't require it anymore. It's not a
Yeah,
requirement. Yeah.
exactly. And so this is where I say to young people, I say, okay, how old was Jesus when he started his public ministry? 30.
Mm-hmm.
What was he doing prior to that? Well, Luke gives us the clue, right? He was growing in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So he actually worked a secular job. He was a carpenter, and then he went to religious school. He trained under the Pharisees. I know we think of the word Pharisee as a bad word, but actually Jesus was part of the order of the Pharisees. That's part of why he blasted them so often. You whitewashed tombs and you brood of vipers, because he knew them. He was part of them,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't like their hypocrisy. But he was trained under the rabbinical school of the Pharisees, and then he started his public ministry in only from 30 to 33, and it's like, why such a short amount of time? And also, what was he doing? He was doing preparation prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always tell my students, don't just like drop out of school and don't say I don't need education or I don't need preparation. I mean, I don't need maturity. You absolutely do. And a lot of them are like, well, people out on the mission field are dying and I just need to preach the gospel. And when Billy Graham was asked, what is your biggest regret in life? He actually said, I wish I had more preparation and more theological training and more education. So, and this is Billy Graham, right? So, and so I encourage people along these lines. And so, as the MDiv is dying,
Yeah.
and which is to the detriment of churches across America, because then you're getting pastors who don't have the education, don't have the training. But in the majority world, it's actually the opposite. In the majority world, you actually have people who value the MDiv, they want the training. And so we have this weird thing where you have too many seminaries in the West. You have not enough seminaries in the majority world. People in the West don't care about theological education, or they are not bothering to get the MDiv. People in the majority world want the education, but they don't have the resources, the money.
Yeah.
They don't
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
seminaries in their backyard. And so what ends up happening is sometimes people will say, okay, well, we will fund all these international students to fly to the West
Yes.
and,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and do their education here. Well, that's in some sense good because, seminaries in the West need it and people in the majority world need it. But on the other hand, it's not good because, first of all, to fly and to pay for this majority world person to live in the US for 3 years is so expensive. And if you had just built a seminary in the majority world, you could educate tons of people for the same price that you're paying someone to fly over. Plus, the people who fly over to the US, they're just getting a Western education. They're not getting
Mm-hmm.
something
Mm-hmm.
contextual to their background.
Yeah.
So now, all that's being said, people might be like, wait, Alan, you're the dean of a seminary in the West that actually teaches international students. And I'm like, yes, but number one, most of our students are online, so they're actually not leaving their home country. So they don't have to have the expense of flying over here and living here. So we have some students who do that. But if they do come here, we expect them to go home. We don't want brain drain. We don't want them to come here and stay here. So expect them to go home. Secondly, we do contextualize our education, so it's not just Western. We're not just teaching them stuff that only Westerners need to hear. We're teaching them stuff that their context needs to hear. So
very good, very good.
Mm-hmm.
And Alan, a lot of times, how are you still keeping it sustainable? are you finding it's still through majority American funders, foundations, or are you seeing younger or philanthropists from those cities emerging out of those places?
Yeah. So a lot of it is actually American funders. Well, not entirely. Like, for example, one of our biggest funders is Yoido Full Gospel Church in
Mm-hmm.
Korea, which
Mm-hmm.
is the biggest church in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Their missions pastor is actually on the board of our seminary. So, and so it's not as if majority world people are all impoverished, right? They actually, some of them have deep pockets, like these mega churches in Korea.
Yeah.
Um, so there's that. But yeah, we have American donors as well. And often I tell people, you know, given that majority world actually has more Christians than we do in the West, so that's actually a phenomenon that's happened in the last 30 years. Okay, and some people are still not aware of that, but there's actually more Christians in the majority world now than
Yep.
in the West. And so if we in the West, so similar problem, but opposite direction. You know, I was talking about funding majority world people to come to the West to learn in our seminaries, which is really expensive. And then, but we also fund American missionaries or Western missionaries to go to the majority world. That's also really expensive. Why not let majority world people be their own missionaries? Because they're
Mm-hmm.
already there. They also know the language and the culture better than us. We don't have to fly them all the way over there. You know, we don't have to raise all this support. So some people say, well, let's just call a moratorium on missions. Let's just have Westerners not go to the majority world then. Well, that's not good either, because the point is partnership. You know, I wrote a book called Polycentric Missiology. And the point with that, a lot of people say, what is polycentric? It just means many centers. And people was like, so we want to hear the voices of everyone around the world. But the difference between polycentric and, so some people ask, is that post-colonial? I'm like, no, actually it's not. Post-colonial is when you say, we don't want to hear the West at all, right? That we only want to hear majority world. That's post-colonial. Polycentric is the West still needs to be part of the conversation. It just can't be the dominant voice, right? It needs to be one of many voices, right? Polycentrism. So, and in this sense, we don't want to say, well, Westerners have no part to play in majority world. So, but I would ask that people, instead of funding missionaries to go over to the majority world, what if you fund the education of majority world people?
Yes.
I mean, there's so many of them already who are Christians, and then they will, and so many of them can do the evangelism. Fund them, right? Fund their education and fund their mission. That's what we need.
Allen, this is why I love you, because this is all based on what Resource Global was built on. Is when I first got to Jakarta for the very first time, I saw all of these different Chinese Indonesians that studied here and now have returned. And so my argument always has been, look, you're going to still need Americans, but what you don't need is an American who raises $150,000 to send their family to learn how to minister to these marketplace leaders who studied here. So don't you want to educate these guys, help them learn how to think, to contextualize their city, to learn the importance of stewardship, generosity, discipleship, all of those things. And now you're forming a team over there. And so at a fraction of the cost that you're doing to fund American missionaries to educate all of them. And now if you could create a network where Nairobi and Jakarta learns from each other, Kuala Lumpur learns from Cape Town learns from Cluj. Now you're trading ideas. You've created a whole network where all of these guys are learning from each other at a fraction of the cost of sending out American missionaries.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. And so we need to re-envision a new model. We need to re-envision a new model of sending. We need to re-envision a new model of funding.
Correct.
I mean, yeah. And, you know, we're seeing young people not as interested in missions. You know, the full disclosure, the reason why I'm no longer at Biola and now I'm at ITS is because they shut down our School of Intercultural Studies. And it's like, why did they do that? Well, because there's not enough enrollment. Not enough young people want to be missionaries. And it's because we're doing things the old way. We're not doing things the new way. And what's the new way? Well, young people, I actually want to push back against the idea that they don't like missions.
Yeah.
They would be interested in missions. They're just worried about money. That's what
Yeah.
it is. So if
Yeah.
you're looking at colleges all across America, what are they majoring in? They are not majoring in liberal arts or humanities. They just want to major in STEM or business because those are the high, return on investment majors, right? And so, I mean, it makes sense, right? They go to college, they pay $50,000 a year, let's say, graduate with $200,000 worth of debt. They're like, how am I going to pay this off, right?
Yeah.
Not with
Yeah.
an English lit degree, right? So that's why they're majoring in STEM and business. But then, but when you say missions, then they're like, oh, that's even worse than, not only do I not make money, but I have to raise support, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so then they don't want to go into missions. And so, and I'm like, that's because we need to re-envision what missions and what fundraising looks like. So,
Yeah.
And here's an example. So I teach summer school every year for Campus Crusade, crew, as they call it. And I train the staff. And I've seen over the years that the crew staff has declined and declined and declined. Also, crew staff is mainly white. Now, don't get me wrong. I love crew. I have a long history with crew. But one time I was teaching their summer school for their staff, and they asked this, like, why are not enough people of color drawn to crew, or why do we keep declining every year? And I'm like, a lot of it is your fundraising model, right?
Yeah.
I said, okay, imagine this. Imagine if you have a young person of color, let's say Black or Latino or what have you, and let's say they're a first generation college student, okay? And their whole church like supports this kid, right? To go to college and fund them. And so what did they hope for that kid to major in? High ROI, right? Return on investment. So engineer, doctor, lawyer, whatever, that sort of thing. Now imagine that kid comes back to the church and says, I know I'm first generation. I'm the first kid, from this church to go to college, and you funded me, you supported me, and now I want to be a missionary. It's like, oh, okay. Yeah. And you want to be a missionary. And then this kid is like, plus I need to now raise support. Now, well, you give me like hundreds of $1,000s so I can go overseas, right? Then the church is like, we just gave you hundreds of $1,000s so you could go to college. Yeah. Now it's supposed to be your return, right? To us. You are our return on investment. So so you're supposed to be our bright shining star who's going to be, a neurosurgeon, and you're going to support our church because we supported you, right? This is very majority world Confucian, right? Filial piety. Like, we know in Asian cultures, right? Parents take care of us and then we take care of them as they're older. Yeah. And so, but if you don't do that, it's sort of seen as offensive and like what? And this younger generation, they're the first generation to make less money than their parents. Okay, so they're already a little bit anxious about money, right? And so, and then with the community pressure, so I'm like, okay, so I talked to my crew class, and I'm like, we got to re-envision how we do fundraising. We got to re-envision how, maybe we need to do more tent making. After all, that is the more biblical model, right? So business as mission, right? BAM, as they call it, maybe something like that, but maybe being bivocational, right? But this is how people are doing it. Young people, they're doing something called the gig economy, where they're like cobbling together a paycheck with different gigs, right? Whether being an Uber driver or a Starbucks barista or being a YouTube star or what have you. And they put all this together. But we need to think more creatively about how to raise funds. Otherwise, we're going to lose the young people and we're going to lose the people of color.
Yeah. I mean, Alan, I think a lot of times my advice for a lot of people is they would probably be more excited about missions if you ask a MIT graduate to move over to Jakarta, Indonesia, to work in a startup on AI to help all these companies. Then they would be, and then raise a little support to help offset some of your costs. I think they would be willing to do it. And then during your free time, go volunteer at church, go be involved in the church, all of that stuff. That is mission as well too. I know a Korean man, older guy, who was just volunteering and was an elder at his church, had a startup, and he knew security. He knew how to do network security, all that stuff. Well, then he started doing missions, and then he started contracting with the government of Malaysia to train all of their students who have high school degrees on how to do network security. That's global missions.
There you
It's a
go.
whole different way of thinking through some of these things.
That's right. Air traffic control, right? There's a lot of people
Yeah,
behind the scenes who are doing stuff, and you don't see them directly as involved in missions, but they're necessary as well. The Lausanne movement, which I'm part of, they have a forum called the Wealth Creation Forum. And a lot of times Christians are kind of like, whoa, wait a minute, wealth creation? Like, isn't like you can't serve God and mammon, right? It's like, but you actually need money in order to be able to fund some of these initiatives, right? And so there are people we need out there to be the wealth creators in order to fund the missions. And
yeah,
so, and
yeah,
all of those people, whether they are the wealth creators or the ones on the front lines, but
yeah,
both of those are necessary.
yeah. Hey, look, I'm hoping as we talk that Christian Moon Guy from Mariners Church, where you go to church, is listening to this, because Christian, you got to talk with Alan, because I'm learning, I resonate so much with what you're talking about here, Alan.
Well, actually, I know him because we're at the same church, but also because he was part of the Lausanne movement. I just came back a few months ago from Korea, where we were
Yeah.
at the
Hmm.
fourth
Hmm.
Lausanne Congress. And for those of you who don't know, who are listening to this podcast, the Lausanne movement is the biggest missions movement in the world. It's a
Yeah.
sort of an umbrella movement that brings together missionaries and missions leaders from all over the world and puts us in the
Yeah.
same room. So the leader of Lausanne, his name is Michael O. He said, he used a pop culture reference. He said it's kind of like Nick Fury and the Avengers, right? He says the Avengers are the superheroes, but Nick Fury is the one that brings them all together as a team. He says Lausanne is Nick Fury, right? But all the missionaries and the mission leaders out there are the Avengers, right? They're the superheroes. But what's the advantage of Lausanne? You bring them all together in the same room. And so we had 5,200 people in the same room in Korea in
Yeah.
September 2024. And Christian was there and I was there. I actually had coffee with Christian when we were there. So
Yeah.
yeah. And but he's doing great things at Mariners Church. And
Alan, if we had met earlier, we have about 5 people from Research Global who are part of Lausanne. I was involved with Lausanne over in Cape Town in 2010, and that really is how Research Global started. From some of our conversations at Cape Town in 2010 is, I'm not sure if I wanted to be with 5,000 people just networking the entire time. So for this one.
yeah, and
Yeah.
the networking is so important. I know sometimes it gets a bad rap. People are like, "Why are you just schmoozing?" And it feels like, is this manipulation? No, it's not. It's building relationships. It's
Yeah.
kingdom relationships, and there have been so many things that have come about since Lausanne that people have partnered with me or discussions, and we've birthed new ideas, and we're collaborating, and so that's really the key. The key at Lausanne was collaboration. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about your work with Denver Seminary. Now, is that research project just for the U.S., or are you looking at different movements in the global South?
Right. So per delineation of the Lilly grant, so the Lilly Foundation, for those of you who don't know, Lilly is actually a pharmaceutical company, multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical company, but they're Christian owned, and so what they do is they actually earmark a certain amount of money for theological education every year, which is really amazing. And again, talk about wealth creation, right? I mean, why not? So they put all this money into an endowment, and they use the endowment money to fund theological education. So Denver Seminary applied for a Lilly grant and got it. And now Lilly does say that the limitations of the grant are to study Christianity in the United States. It's not for global. Now that being said, they're not against global.
Yeah.
They specifically the grant is for the U.S. However, given that the United States is so global internally,
Global. Yes.
right?
Yes.
Like you could actually study the whole world just right across the street from you, right? Or in your neighborhood. So what we are doing is studying Gen Z. That's what the stated purpose of what we applied for the Lilly grant was. Now, that being said, Gen Z, I feel like all the research about it thus far, and there's been a lot of research on it. I mean, when we were at Lausanne, they broke us up into 25 issue groups. They said these are the 25 most pressing things we need to focus on in the world. And they said you get to choose which one of the 25 groups that you're part of. And overwhelmingly people chose the Gen Z group. Like everyone
Mm,
wanted to study the next generation. And so on the one hand, it's almost overstudied. It's like, there should be other things that people focus on. For example, at Lausanne, of the 25 groups, another one of them was ministering to the aging population. Nobody cares about the elderly, right? Everyone just wants to minister to Gen Z. So I'm like, oh, there's other gaps that people should be focused on as well. And another one of the groups was, I was really grateful that it was polycentric mission. So because I wrote the book Polycentric Missiology, this is the group that I led and I was part of. So it was great to see all these people in the same room interested in polycentric mission.
yeah.
But going back to Gen Z, although there's been a lot of ink spilled about this topic, almost all of the studies have been white normative. Okay. So what I am aiming to do with at Denver Seminary, we're calling this the Young Adult Initiatives, the YAI. So what we are aiming to do is to study, to disaggregate like by ethnicity, because I think there's this false narrative that Gen Z is the first generation in the world to be homogeneous because their whole experience is mediated by screens. And while that is sort of true, because of the algorithm online, as you know, people get siloed information. In other words, whatever you click on, they'll give you more of that. So this is what has caused so many people in this world to become politically divisive or whatever, right? Because you click on this thing that you're interested in, then the algorithm says, okay, they want more of that, and they just only feed you that. And after a while, people's screens only give you what you're already interested in. And so then you're interacting only with people who are only just like you. And then you think, what is wrong with those crazy people out there who think differently from me? Everything I see on my feed is just what I believe. It's like, right. So, because that's how the algorithm works, right? But this means that people's experience mediated by screens is vastly different depending on the algorithm. So I actually don't think it's true that everyone in Gen Z has the same experience because they're all mediated by screens. So we're going to actually look at within the United States, white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian, and just see what their difference in experiences are, and how they are being raised, and how they're what sort of how they're reacting to certain political traumas. For example, George Floyd, right? Again, that was a national thing that all people in the US shared, but how they downloaded that was mediated by the algorithm. And so some people looked on their screens and everything was very pro George Floyd. And then some people looking at the screens, everything was anti George Floyd. And they didn't have the same experience, even though it was the same political thing going on. Right. So, or COVID, right? And the anti-Asian racism that came out of that, and the mental health issues that came out of that. And so I think it's really important for us to study the different ethnicities within Gen Z, and I think that'll give us different data.
Yeah. And how long will this study take, this research project be?
Yeah, we have the grant for 2 years, so we have it until the end of 2026.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. And we're actually going to be working with a number of exciting other young adult initiatives along the way. Urbana, the Student Missionary Conference, which happens once every 3 years. The next one is December of 2025. So I am very close with the people who run Urbana. It's sponsored by InterVarsity. And so we're going to be doing a lot of stuff partnering with Urbana. And then, of course, Lausanne, every 10 years, they have a Younger Leaders Gathering.
Yeah.
So they're going to have Lausanne Younger Leaders Gathering in 2026 in Brazil. Now, of course, that's global. So that may not be as much with our direction that we're going with, but still, that's going to be a really interesting gathering, and I think really opportune. Yeah.
Yeah, Alan, I am so looking forward. I mean, we're running out of time, but this is the first, hopefully, of many conversations. And I think a lot of times, whether it's Lausanne or Urbana, Greg Howe was the one who was our founding chairman, and Tom Lin was the one who helped us think through some of these things. So there's a lot for us to talk about in terms of how to work with this next generation.
Wonderful. I love Tom and Greg. They're wonderful
Yeah.
guys.
Alan, I really am hoping that will be the beginning of a longer conversation. And for me to really be able to follow what you're doing, to hear all the things that you're up to as well, too. And for the people in our network and the Resource Global family to learn from you and just the work that you're working on.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
This is exciting, and there's so much that we can look forward to with Gen Z and with Majority World, especially as most of the Gen Z in the world is going to be Majority World, right? We're seeing in the West declining populations. Every two parents are having only one kid, whereas in the Majority World, every two parents are having multiple kids. And so Gen Z in the Majority World is really going to be the big thing in the next generation.
Yeah. And even a lot of times I was in Tokyo a lot. You look at Tokyo, the number of people, younger people in Japan are leaving, and Koreans are staying over in Korea to work with companies like Samsung, different things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So the Panasonics and the Sonys of the day, which were so popular in the 80s and 90s, are stabilized, and they're not seen as creative places, innovative places. So when I was in Tokyo, they were telling me they're replacing it with people from Brazil or Vietnam. I go to Sao Paulo in Brazil. There's a humongous community of Japanese people over in Brazil.
That's
and
right.
so they kept telling me, Tommy, there's so many Asian restaurants here. And I walked to these Asian restaurants. They're all Japanese restaurants.
Yep.
And so how that course changes some of our cities is going to be really unique.
Right. Immigration patterns and Majority World and economics, and these are all linked. And I should clarify something I said earlier. Earlier, I was saying Majority World is increasing in population and Western is decreasing. It's actually not so much that split. It's more economics. So rich industrialized countries are having fewer and fewer kids. Developing nations are having more and more kids. And so Japan and Korea are also facing the same declining population as the West. And so they need more, as you said, immigration in order to bolster their workforce.
And Alan, I'm 47 years old. I still remember sitting there at my church, and they brought in a missions organization way back when I was in the second, third grade. I still remember it. Their theme, and they had a song. It was, God, please don't send me to Africa. And I look back, I said, wow, it felt so long ago, because it's a whole different world. With technology and everything, the world has become smaller and people are going from place to place. And it's easy for Chinese to be in Africa, not always a good thing, but also Latin America and all this stuff all merging together.
Yeah. And actually, speaking of, China is actually making a lot of economic inroads in Africa, not necessarily in a good
Not in
way.
a good way.
Right. And they are really buying up a lot of land. They're actually doing a lot of development, but they're also exploiting the natural resources. And so, so this cross-cultural interaction sometimes has negativity. Yeah.
Yes. And then when our cohorts all get together, the folks in Nairobi have a certain view of the Chinese. But then yet when the Chinese Indonesians or Chinese Malaysians all sit at the table, they have no idea what in the world that the folks from Kenya are understanding. So when they're sitting there together, they're able to understand, wow, this is what's happening in your city. Those guys are able to say, wow, so you really don't understand. This is your perspective. You're able to change. You're able to really be able to learn from each other and to honor each culture as you continue to get to know each other in a relationship.
That's right. Yeah. And hopefully, places like China, they can bring negativity, like I said, exploitation. China has this, what they call the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're just trying to create this global virtual sort of Silk Road as they take over the whole world economically. But then there's also the positives. A lot of the Chinese diaspora are actually Christians. And so wherever they go, bringing their business practices, they can actually also bring Christianity. So we're seeing that in places like, Indonesia, right? It's like the Indonesians are Muslim, but the Chinese Indonesians are mainly Christian. And so.
Love it. We have a lot to talk about. Alan, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tommy.
Talk soon.